All right. Yeah. Let's try this again. School, learning, teaching, stuff. Okay, cool. Take me a minute to remember what I was doing here, right? So let's kick off with Andrew Jackson. So this is going to be one of our first actual case studies into a United States president. Usually when we look at American history in this broad perspective, we tend to get stuck on a few presidents that we focus on, but we don't really focus on any others. We all know this. We know about the Washingtons and the Jeffersons and the Lincolns, sometimes the Kennedys when you get further down the line. Like, we know about these, the Roosevelts, right? But there's one that I really want to dial in on right now, and that is a guy by the name of Andrew Jackson. You need to know who this guy is, because he is one of the most controversial presidents we've ever had, because he was really one of the first presidents to really establish the idea of what authority the president of the United States had. So we have this executive branch world, the president, all of them. This is the first time we really see the president really start to like grab power and say, no, I can do this, I can do this, I can do this. And of course, to no surprise, it absolutely sets off a bunch of people and irritates them to no end. Jackson is frequently seen as a very polarizing president. You either really liked what he did as president, or you really didn't like what he did as president. And that's not just saying at that time in the 1820s, 1830s. That's even in the modern day when we take a closer look at Jackson. So, with that said, let's explore a few little details about Jackson. So, Jackson was was a salty fellow. Let's put it that way. So, back in the day when he got into office, he had a friend who was also the Secretary of War, John Eden. John Eden, this is a true story. I promise you it's a true story. So John Eden marries this lady named Margaret. We're going to call her Peggy because why not, right? Now, here's the deal. The people in Washington, D.C. at this time are like uppity, like uppy up folks, right? You see what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. So they see Peggy and they judge her something harsh. She's not from the rich family. She's not well educated. She doesn't look like us. She doesn't act like us. She doesn't have Louis Vuitton or Gucci, like all these different things. Like, it was pretty bad, right? Well, a lot of the people, a lot of the women in Washington, D.C. that were so judgmental of her were also the wives of the people that were in the cabinet of the president, meaning the select group of people, of advisors that the president spoke to. So Jackson turns around and says, listen, y'all got to stop. Be nice. I'm vouching for Mr. Eden and I'm vouching for his wife, Peggy. So in doing so, here's what he does. In 1831, he gets so tired of listening to all of it. He says, you know what? I've warned all of you to knock it off. Y'all are still clucking around like chickens. So my whole cabinet, all of you people, those advisors, you, your wives, and the socialists, you're fired. Goodbye. He dismisses his whole cabinet. He gets rid of the whole cabinet solely on that one specific issue. It's not even about like the United States. It's not about some international policy. It's just about the fact that they were mean to one woman, which by all means is still not appropriate, but it gives you a context of who Jackson is. Like, he has zero issues of just getting rid of people right off the bat, right? So that was the beginning phase. Now, a lot of people believe Jackson was going to be in for just one term, so 4 years, and that was going to be it. So a lot of them positioned themselves, a lot of politicians positioned themselves to make a run at his office, assuming that he would only be here for 4 years. Jackson, at the same time, did a lot inside the United States. So he is still, to this day, I think, the only president to take office while the United States had debt. No surprise there. He left office with the United States actually making a profit, so they were in the black, meaning they weren't losing money or they weren't spending more money than they were making per year. Fascinating that he was able to do that even at that time. So I was like, well, they don't spend as much then as they did now. There wasn't as much to purchase back then either, so it's still a significant factor that he's able to do that as president of the United States. when we keep looking down, he was known for his budgeting. A lot of people would look at him and were sitting back going, oh, he's a great president. A lot of that would come back to his budgeting abilities of saying like, yeah, we're not spending money on this, that, and the other. Now, that's the bright side of Jackson. The economic piece, sometimes even the international policy piece, kind of kept us out of a war with France. Like, those are significant and very important, and a lot of people will look at Jackson and say, look at what he did, this is great. On the flip side, there's something that is in Jackson's legacy that really honestly probably ruined his reputation of potentially being considered a great president. And this was by his choice, make no mistake. It wasn't one of those like, oh, he didn't have a... No, it's on him. And this would be what's referred to as the Trail of Tears. So the Trail of Tears, think of Southeast United States today. So Georgia, Florida, maybe South Carolina, Alabama, that area, all right? So... the United States wanted to continue to develop that area because, hey, we take land. That's how we roll, right? At the same time, there were several large Native American nations that lived within those areas. Most notably, for the sake of history, the Cherokee Nation. So Jackson was caught in a predicament. Again, not to excuse him. He had two options. Either he knew that people were going to go down into the Southeast and they're going to develop the United States and they're going to kill any Native American that were down there in their way, or he could try to relocate them to a different place in North America. Right. Now, we sit back in 2021 or whatever year this is and say, either way, that's not a good choice. You shouldn't remove someone from their own property. Right. Jackson was trying to find the best between two evils. So he decides to move them. He marches them, literally, like marches, them from the Southeast United States to really close to modern day Oklahoma, which you're going from happiness of Georgia and peaches to Oklahoma. And the reason they went to Oklahoma was because the white folks living in the area, we did not know how to actually use agriculture in a clay-based soil like Oklahoma had, so we didn't know how to grow anything there. So the belief was if we can't grow anything there and it's worthless, give it to somebody else. Again, ethically, really bad choice. On top of that, a lot of the marching took place during the winter, and it's still recorded this day one of the worst winters in the Southeast United States. So you had a bunch of Native Americans, without even shoes in some cases, marching through 6, 7, 8 inches of snow, and you can imagine people died along the way. It was a travesty. To this day, we're still reeling from it. And Jackson thought it was the best idea. But at the same time, when we look back, we go, there really was no best idea between these two instances. And really, the Trail of Tears ends up marring his existence inside the presidency for the most part. He fought with the banks, no surprise there. He was reelected, and he was reelected with for a second term with a huge popularity. Jackson wound up becoming an extremely popular president, and a lot of that revolved around the fact, even from the Eaton affair, right? So back in the Washington cabinet, because he was so adamantly against the rich. Like, the socialistas of the time drove him absolutely insane. So he adamantly fought against those who were extremely wealthy, note the banks, and fought for the people who weren't. Well, that was the majority of Americans at the time. Not a lot of people were rich anyway. So the popularity of the president was pretty high when he ran for that second election. Moving on, South Carolina loses their mind. Remember, in the Revolutionary War, we blamed Boston for everything? Well, it's 1832, so we're about 30 years away from the Civil War. We're going to start blaming South Carolina for everything. South Carolina tries to secede from the Union in 1832 because of taxes, called the Tariff of 1832. Jackson knocks that off. He says, nope, you're not breaking away from the Union. That's not how this works. He sets the precedent of saying, like, no, we don't have states that break away from the Union. Texas. So, because he did that, Lincoln 30 years later will turn around and go, oh, South Carolina, you decided to break away? Cool. Well, I'll see you at war. He was a people person, as we already talked about. Unfortunately for him, he dealt with a lot of personal issues as well. He loved his wife dearly, Rachel. She died somewhat unexpectedly, and it really bore him down. In the modern day, we would definitely diagnose with Jackson with several things, including obviously depression was very clear. He also had developed PTSD from fighting in multiple wars on top of that. And he had been injured during those wars, old wounds, 1800s. They're not healing very fast anyways, harsh military life. Jackson was a worn old person when he was in office by the standards of the 1800s. When Rachel dies, it just adds that much more grief to him, that much more weight to him. In a lot of ways, if he hadn't been the president at the time, if he didn't have that driving force, most likely he would have died pretty quickly after that, just from everything collapsing in on him. He ends up taking a lot of more time with his family during the second term. After all this happens, his whole family moves into the White House, which is very interesting. He did work a lot with Texas and their independence movement against Mexico, and France also. When France determined, hey, we're not paying back any debts, and we're like, you don't pay debts with us, we will go to war with you. So there we go. There's that. And then finally, he leaves office, and he's also, believe it or not, on top of all that, he is the first president to face an assassination attempt in 1835. Stabbing did not go well for the person trying to stab him, did not work out in the long run. So he left office in 1837, and then when he left in 1837, there were well-wishers and supporters lining the route back to his house. Everyone was thrilled to have him. Not everybody. A lot of people were thrilled to have him as a president. And he would eventually go to Nashville. And then in 1845, he finally dies. And which really unfortunate, because he fought to hang on for life for honestly like 10 years, 1835 to really 1845. During the final years, they say Jackson was constantly in pain. He had chronic infections of some sort, losing his vision, losing his hearing. Like, really, once he stepped out of the office, like I said, everything just collapsed. He was surrounded by his family when he finally passed away in 1845. And there's a lot of people who would argue that the most peace that came to Jackson truly in his life was when he finally died. So Jackson really becomes this almost like a personification of the presidency in the United States, in the sake of this, that one, there's going to be mistakes made by the president, obviously, but two, the other big important piece to this really revolves around the expectation, the unspoken expectation that as president, you really are going to sacrifice everything of yourself in order to preserve the country. And Jackson really is the first president, not the last. He's the first one to really encapsulate that idea and that concept. Of course, it's unspoken. It's not saying that's the way it has to be, but in a lot of ways, when we look at American history, we see that in many instances, presidents sacrifice a lot in those 4 to 8 years that they're in office, of their personal lives, their health, and so many other different things. So, welcome to Jackson. Andrew Jackson was really, I would almost argue, the beginning of the imagery of the modern American president. Lived a very rough life, fought a lot of fights outside and inside the White House, was a little salty, kind of cranky. If you ever see a photo of him or an artist rendition of him, you'd think that too. But in the end, when all was said and done, the people loved him, even when he left and eventually when he died. So there you go, Andrew Jackson.